Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. I'm with the Center for Migration Studies of New York. It's a think tank that's been in existence since 1964, and it was founded by the Scalabrini Fathers, which is a Catholic religious order. And we're part of the Scalabrini International Migration Network. The Scalabrinis, they're really street priests, if you will. They're in the field. They have 270 programs for migrants around the world. So I was very attracted to their work because they really know what's happening with the migrants in real time, which oftentimes at the UN, that's missing, frankly. And it was sort of missing in the Global Compact on Migration negotiations, but I shouldn't get into that. But let me just talk about from a U.S. perspective, because that's my experience, and tell you a little bit about how the U.S. system seeks to protect refugees and other migrants in vulnerable situations, migrants who may have a protection need but may not meet the refugee definition that you need. So there are 22 million refugees in the world, 25 million if you count the Palestinians, and some do and some don't, but that's the difference between the two figures. And a refugee is a person who flees their country of origin, usually to a country of first asylum, and has a credible fear of persecution based on 5 grounds: nationality, member of a social group, race, religion, and a political opinion. So if they can meet that standard, they're recognized as refugees by the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. And they're all around the world, as you know. In Africa, in Asia, there's not one part of the world that does not have refugees in need of protection. So the United States has been involved in refugee protection for years. I mean, the U.S. was founded by refugees. Frankly, our first visitors, first pioneers were fleeing persecution, religious persecution in England, the Pilgrims. So we have a rich history of being refugees, being an immigrant country, certainly, a diverse country. So we have a tradition of trying to protect immigrants and refugees, despite what some of the headlines say these days. What is the interest of protecting these vulnerable people? Of course, you save lives. There's been, refugees are in danger, and less than 1% of the world's refugees are resettled. These are the most vulnerable of the refugees. These are refugees that have been determined by the United Nations that they can't even survive in the country of first asylum. A Syrian refugee, for example, cannot survive in Lebanon or Jordan, for example, and it may be vulnerable groups such as women head of households, the elderly, the disabled, depending on how the UN assesses people. But less than 1% are resettled, despite all the attention given to resettlement in some. The refugee program and our protection policies reflects our values, as I mentioned, our values of welcoming newcomers, of protecting refugees as being a safe haven for refugees around the world. And I have a quote up there from President Reagan, who was a conservative Republican. So it's a bipartisan sort of program, frankly, that's been supported by both Democrats and Republicans over the years. It also promotes stability. Whenever you're in a war zone, you're in a conflict zone, if you're able to resettle the most vulnerable, it relieves some of the burden on the host countries. And, about 5% of the countries worldwide host 80 to 90% of the refugees. And that's really what the Global Compact on Refugees is about, to create more of a responsibility sharing mechanism for more countries to share in the responsibility of protection. It also is a good model for countries who may be experiencing a large number of refugees coming in, like Europe, for example, where they could create more regulated arrivals. They can control and manage the refugees that are coming in, and they can vet them more easily. And under our program, there is a lot of vetting that goes on. They go through security clearances. They go through more interviews than anybody that comes to this country. So it is a way, it's a good model to sort of meet that responsibility sharing burden, but do it in a way that's secure, in a way that is in the best interest of both the refugees and your country, because the refugees don't have to cross an ocean or a desert to get to where you are. And of course, it promotes goodwill around the world. It promotes cooperation between countries, in counterterrorism efforts and other efforts to address destabilized situations. So there's a lot of good reasons for doing refugee protection, despite the fact that we have those in this country, and I'm sure across the world, who would not want any refugees resettled. Go with the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Oops. So the refugee program here, which has been developed since 1980 when it was created under statute, is a community-based program, and it's a great example of a public-private partnership where the government and private organizations work together to resettle refugees and to integrate them into the country. There's 10 resettlement organizations in the country that resettle refugees. Many are faith-based, others are not, but they have extensive ties in the community and can draw upon resources from the community to help resettle refugees who come in. The vetting process is about 1 to 2 years. UNHCR usually identifies vulnerable populations. The US government will say, well, we want to look at this population or that population for various reasons. And then they go through a long series of interviews with UNHCR, sometimes with IOM, and certainly with the country that they may be going to. And then they're run through all the agencies, relevant agencies, databases to make sure that they don't have a criminal background or a terrorist background. So it's very safe, as I mentioned. They get about a year's worth of cash assistance. They qualify for certain benefits, medical, and the community organizations, the 10 organizations, help them get employment and housing and help them transition into self-sufficiency, which happens for the majority of them within a year. So it's very successful in transitioning refugees from when they arrive and when they become self-sufficient. And the key thing that's not up there is they come with a green card, which means they come as a permanent resident, and they're eligible to apply for citizenship a year later. So they can become citizens within 6 years, which is very quick under US standards, which is important because they have permanence, they have leverage in the workplace, and they have more rights because they're permanent residents. We've resettled an average of 75,000 a year. The numbers were higher post-Vietnam because we resettled a lot of Vietnamese. And I must say, frankly, the program has been used for political purposes, certainly during the Cold War, in terms of the ideological battle between the USSR and the US. The US would target refugees from that part of the world to come to the US. So it has been used for political purposes, but since the end of the Cold War, it's had to transition into more humanitarian purposes. It always had a humanitarian purpose, don't get me wrong, but in the decisions that the US has made, they've been strategic at times, to some criticism as well. And of course, we've resettled refugees from all around the world, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. So let me talk about a couple other protection tools that the US deploys on not refugees. Certainly they provide overseas assistance to refugees so that they can be taken care of in their country of first asylum. But for those who may not meet the refugee definition, and this is really a hot potato between the Global Compact of Refugees and Migrants, which document was going to address migrants who may have a protection concern, but may not necessarily meet the definition. They may be a climate change refugee, or they may just be fleeing generalized violence, and they're sort of in the middle. They don't get that automatic international protection that the UN would give them, but they need to be protected. So one thing that the US has done is they passed a statute in 1990 called temporary protected status, and it's for nationals of countries that have undergone or are in conflict or have some sort of natural disaster. So places like Haiti, places like El Salvador and Honduras, which had major hurricanes, the US decided we're going to provide legal status and work authorization to those nationals who are already in the country for a certain amount of time, so that they don't have to go back until the country is recovered. And what that does is it helps the country recover with remittances, certainly. and they don't have to take back those who are deported until a time certain. The criticism, of course, has been that this is not temporary because there have been long-standing populations. The Salvadorans have been here since 1999 when they had their hurricane. So it's become a bit of a political hot potato, and of course the Trump administration is starting to roll it back, unfortunately. But it has been an effective tool in helping to stabilize country conditions in countries where there is war or civil war or some sort of natural disaster where the country can't recover from. And we did a study on the major populations that are here. One stat is that 200,000 of the Haitians, Hondurans, and Salvadorans have 273,000 U.S. children already. They have 85% workforce participation, 30% have mortgages, and 80% live above the poverty line. So when you give them work, they will work and they will contribute to the society. The problem and what the U.S. needs to look at is like once they become more integrated, do you pull the rug from under them at that point and send them back? And that's what we're facing right now. The other tools that the U.S. deploys for protection is humanitarian parole. That's something in immigration law. We can parole someone into the country on an emergency basis if we feel like the situation is such that we need to respond to large numbers of people. Asylum protection, that's for those who come to the country, come to our port of entries, come to our country and request protection. Those are asylum seekers, and those numbers are much higher. And then family-based petitions as well can be used. So I think my time is coming to a close. I just wanted to tell you about, we have a report we did on contributions that refugees have made over several years to our country, economic and otherwise. I have a lot of stats, but I'm not going to go through them all. But they've been very successful, even more successful than Native populations in getting work and integrating and becoming Americans and being part of the country. So I'll let you look at the report. I won't go through all the stats, but it's significant that the refugees over time integrate into society and become Americans. So, and one last thing, just on what we're going through now in the U.S., is that the president determines every year how many refugees will come in. And he or she, well, we've only had he's, but consults with Congress on the number. And right at this moment, we're in a fight with the administration because they've lowered the total to 30,000, which is the lowest number we've ever had. We usually have about 75 to 90,000 we bring in a year. And it's really unfortunate. Hopefully we'll get back to a higher number. But right now we're going through this, and it really leaves a lot of refugees who have already been interviewed, actually, already been vetted in many cases, in danger in those countries. And of course, you've heard about the travel ban, which was upheld by the Supreme Court, and that limits from several countries that are, including Syria, the numbers that are coming in. So we're sort of in a crisis right now on the refugee program, and I'll be glad to answer any questions if you have any on that. Sorry if I went over my time. Thank you.